Well, good evening or whatever time it is for those who may be watching. So hopefully you've come because you saw that there was going to be this presentation on using FusionReactor and FusionAnalytics and FusionDebug to solve your CF server and coding challenges. And there was a description of that talk on the meetup site for the Nova CFUG. So hopefully you've taken a look at that. You know what you're in for. It's going to be about an hour and a half, maybe with some time for questions, a little more on demonstrating these three tools and showing why they're so powerful and valuable for people trying to solve CF server problems. And I say CF, but it also all the products, FusionReactor and FusionDebug work with Railo as well. FusionAnalytics for now only works with ColdFusion. And FusionReactor also works with any Java server, not just ColdFusion and Railo. And it does also work with BlueDragon, but it can also work with Tomcat, JBoss, WebLogic, Glassfish, Jetty, whatever you might use. So powerful tools, and we'll show you them and help you understand what they're all about. So I'm Charlie Arehart. I don't work for the company that makes FusionReactor. I do work with them. I'm an independent consultant, and I do CF server troubleshooting for a living. I spend my days every day helping people solve CF and Railo and occasionally BlueDragon problems with tools like FusionReactor, FusionAnalytics, FusionDebug. Also, work with them if they have other tools like the server monitor, etc. But I love FusionReactor, and I often am showing people who have other monitoring tools, whether it's ColdFusion monitoring tools or tools like New Relic or JVM tools. I help them to see why FusionReactor in particular is so valuable for troubleshooting CF server problems. And we'll explain where FusionAnalytics comes into the picture and where it has unique value over anything else you can find. And then we'll conclude by talking about FusionDebug. And some of you may know FusionDebug is an interactive step debugging tool for ColdFusion and for Railo. And some of you may say, well, doesn't Adobe already have a step debugger? And they do, but there's reasons why you might want to use FusionDebug. So we'll talk about that at the end, what its advantages are over other tools. Again, not least of which is that if you run on Railo, you don't have a step debugger, and so FusionDebug is the best step debugger for you. And I would argue that FusionDebug is even the best step debugger for ColdFusion. So again, we'll save that for later on. All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and proceed. I had been trying to start up some various demonstrations, and I think I've got too much going on my machine, so even paging through my stuff here in PowerPoint is a little much. And don't anybody infer from that that there's some problem because of a tool like FusionReactor. Not at all. It's very low overhead. But I've got PowerPoint, Outlook, multiple browsers, ColdFusion, CF Builder, all running, and it's all a bit just much for my machine at the moment. So I'm shutting down one of the browsers and all of its tabs. So in a moment it'll catch up. Anyway, sorry about that. Alrighty. So again, first we're going to start talking about FusionReactor, and I'm going to explain first why one would use it and who would benefit from it, and then we'll dive into some demos. So don't worry, we're not going to spend a lot of time. In fact, I don't have any slides for this. I'm just going to talk about why would you use FusionReactor, and then we're going to talk about the other tools. So what do we do when we have ColdFusion server problems, right? I mean, or Railo, whatever you use, Railo, ColdFusion, BlueDragon, Java servers. But especially I'm talking to ColdFusion people because that's, this is the ColdFusion user group, North Virginia ColdFusion user group. What do we do when CF's in trouble, right? We tend to restart ColdFusion. Hopefully that'll fix it. And sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the problem just ends up coming back. Plus, restarting ColdFusion to solve the problem, maybe it takes you 20 minutes to know that you got a problem, and all that time people are complaining, and the reason why you're restarting it is because people are complaining. Wouldn't you like to be able to solve the problem and not have to restart ColdFusion? So that's really where FusionReactor comes in. It helps you identify what the problem is. And if you've never had a tool like this, and I work with people every day, most people don't, if you've never had a tool like this to see what's going on, you're in the dark. And most people that have CF and Railo and Java servers are in the dark, and they have no idea what's going on. So all they can do when things go wrong is restart it and cross their fingers. And sometimes that's not going to be good enough, because sometimes the problem's going to come right back, and you just can't keep restarting it. I was working with a client just today, and they were restarting their servers 5 times today. And I got in there with them, and I said, look, you know, it doesn't have to be that way. We got FusionReactor on board. The next time things went wrong, we were able to help see what the problem was and help resolve it. And I'm saying I do this with people every day. So it's a great tool. It's much better than just restarting ColdFusion. And the thing is that it's not just for using while there's a problem, because some of you may know that sometimes things get so bad you can't get into the administrator. And maybe you might find you can't even get into FusionReactor, in which case you may say, well, there you go. That's why I can't use it, because when the problem's so bad, I can't get into ColdFusion. If I can't get into FusionReactor, what's the point? Well, the point is FusionReactor is more than just a monitor. It also has, for instance, alerting features. You could be told that the problem is coming before it gets so bad that things hang up. And even if they do go so far as to get hung up, the alerting features will tell you in an email not only that there was a problem, but what the problem was. And it'll make more sense once we see the demonstration. But just take my word for it, with FusionReactor, you can see at a point in time what requests are running. And if things are bad and there's a bunch of requests taking a long, long time, FusionReactor will show you very clearly, here's the requests that are running, here's the URLs, here's the IP address, here's how long they've been running, and much more. But I'm saying, what if you can't get into the interface to see it? Well, you set up these alerts, and the alerts come to you by email, and in the email, it tells you what requests were running, what IP address they were, and how long they were running, and what query they were running. And even with the right understanding of how to use the alert, you can see down to the line of code what the requests were that were taking a long time. So you can see that while problems happening, if you can get onto the server, you can see it in the email, in the alert, even if you're not able to get to the server, or maybe you come in the morning or come back from lunch and CF crashed during lunch or overnight, you'll have an email there that'll tell you at the time things went bad, what was wrong. So Hassan was talking about, you know, how you all use, in your particular organization, you use it to look at long-running requests. Well, some people focus on parts of FusionReactor that show you what requests did take a long time, and some people want to make long-running requests stop taking a long time. That's one way to use it, but I'm saying from a tactical problem-solving, I'm saying when things go bad, I'll show you how you can use FusionReactor to see details you've never seen before, and I'll show you how it's got alerts that can notify you even when you're not paying attention. So don't think you've got to sit around watching a monitor all day. Who wants to do that? You can get these alerts by email, any number of people you want, and with them you can figure out often what went on when things went bad. And then finally I want to say too that after it crashes and comes back up, maybe you come in the morning, maybe you didn't even set up the alerts, or maybe you didn't get an alert. Well, there's another thing that FusionReactor can do for you, and that is that it's got tremendous logs. So we could look at the logs of FusionReactor and see what was going on just before the crash. It keeps logs for 30 days. And so you'll almost always have the logs for right before, whenever your crash was, and you'll be able to look at them and often get the same information out of the logs that you would have gotten out of the interface. Sometimes there's more information in the logs than you'd see in the interface. But the point is, you can find out in these logs what went on. And if you've never seen it before, it's amazing and really valuable. And if we have time, we'll take a look at that. Okay, so I just want to stress that it's more than just a monitor. It's something that you can use before a problem happens, while a problem's happening, and even after you've restarted ColdFusion. Okay, so I hope that helps you to see that it's more than just a monitor. And then who benefits from using FusionReactor? And it's not just developers or administrators. You might have in mind who you think benefits. Certainly people that administer ColdFusion servers benefit, but they are often busy with other jobs and they can't sit around watching babysitting ColdFusion. So they're the ones who especially benefit from things like the alerts and the logs. But somebody might have a primary responsibility to tend ColdFusion all day, and they may find that they would love sitting there watching FusionReactor's interface and learning from it. They may also use it to identify problem areas, and of course developers could use it to understand problem areas that may be due to their code. We'll see when I do a demonstration in a moment. You might see that a request is slow because of a long-running query, or maybe somebody's got to tweak that query. Or maybe we'll see, as I often see with people, that a request is slow because it's doing 500 queries. And that's not as unusual as you might think. I help many people who have requests that for one reason or another, one request does hundreds of queries. And when you can see that happening in a tool like FusionReactor, you might go, huh, I didn't know we did that many queries in there. Who did that? Let's go get that person and figure out what the problem is. And you can see that very easily. And then management benefits, because if you can help keep CF from going down all the time, you're a hero, right? And whether you're a hero or not, that's not the point, right? But they want to see CF stop going down. I mean, I've worked with plenty of people for whom CF, or maybe Railo or BlueDragon, is an annoyance to them because it's always hanging up, always going down, and nobody understands why, and they keep restarting it. That doesn't solve the problem. And they even maybe get so far as saying, let's get rid of this thing. Come on, let's move to .NET, let's move to PHP, let's move to Ruby, let's move to Python, let's move to anything. Just get off this ColdFusion stuff that's always crashing. Well, trust me, I help people every day make those crashes go away, sometimes in less than an hour of looking at things with them. And I have many, many, many customers who I hear from weeks later, and they say, wow, since we talked, CF hasn't gone down ever since. And it's just amazing, because when you have the right tools to be able to solve the problem, you make the problem go away. And you might make the ColdFusion problem go away, and people can focus on their business. Or maybe somebody was planning to do a rewrite to another language. And trust me, that's not trivial. I know a lot of people who say we're going to rewrite our applications into whatever language, and a year later, it hasn't happened. Because these applications you've written over the years are very complex, and you can't just rewrite them. So management could benefit by forestalling the need to move to some new platform. Or I have lots of people who want to move to a new server. Oh, that's our problem. Our server's just not up to this load. So let's get a bigger server. Let's go to multiple instances. Let's go to clusters. Let's go to replicated databases and multiple data centers across the world. I mean, I see people spend an inordinate amount of money thinking they're going to solve a problem, and they don't yet really understand what the real problem is, and they may not realize that they moved to this shiny, new, powerful platform, and the problem just follows them because they didn't solve the real problem. They just split it over multiple machines, or they just, created multiple instances that maybe share a connection even to if one database, and the database is the problem, or maybe it's not the database at all. Maybe it's the multiple instances talk to some third-party server, and the problem's with the third-party server, and nobody knew that. And the ColdFusion pages are doing a CF HTTP to the third-party server, and that's not going to be solved by you doing multiple replicated instances. So I'm just trying to say there's a lot of things that are different than what people think, and your management could save a lot of money and heartache if they better understood and if you help them better understand their problems. And finally, of course, your users benefit because you make the problems go away. Their requests respond when they ask for them. So it's a tremendous tool. So enough about why you'd want to use it. Let's take a look at a demo of it. So let's start with, first I want you all to know who don't know if you've never seen it before. So FusionReactor is a monitoring tool from a company called Integral, but the website is fusion-reactor.com, fusion-reactor.com. If you just Google it, generally it'll come up among the first things, but there are other things out there with use of the name FusionReactor. That's why they can't say fusionreactor.com. They have to put the dash in. Anyway, here's the FusionReactor website. There's tremendous resources. There's videos, there's feature pages, there's information on pricing and support, and I'll talk about those later. There's a demo, and I want you guys to see this. There's a demo. So in a moment, I'm going to show you that demo, and I just want to clarify. You ought to get it and download it and use it, and there's a free trial. But if you're reluctant for whatever reason to do that in your environment, check out the free demo. So you just click on that demo button, and we'll go to it, and I'll show you that in a moment. And then you could download it, and there is a free trial. It's a 14-day trial, and you can implement it in your server, and it just requires a restart of ColdFusion. And for the most part, it's about a 5-minute job from start to finish with the restart of ColdFusion, and boom, it's in there and it's doing its job, and we'll see the interface in a moment, and it'll instantly be tracking stuff in the logs. And there are many people for whom that becomes just valuable, and even if they never take the time to learn how to use the tool, they just get it in place and it's tracking stuff, and when things go wrong, they can bring somebody like me or the folks behind the company. Integral, they have support as well. You can hire them on a consulting basis to help troubleshoot your problems. And I'll talk about buying it and getting support, all that later, finding out more. But let's take a look at the demo. So if you click on that link, you're just taken right to the demo. and I'll take you there. It's already in another tab. So here's a live running demo. You see up there in the URL, it's demo.fusion-reactor.com. So anybody could go run this. You don't have to have any special privileges or log in or anything like that. And this is a real server that's running on the web, and it's constantly getting some traffic. Now, let me just say, before we go any further, it's a synthetic load. It's just running basically certain requests over and over, and one of them is a very long running request. So the graphs here depict probably not a typical environment for you, but yeah, well, let's just talk about it. So when you come into the FusionReactor interface, and if you get into it in your first time and it's not looking at this page, you might come in looking at the FusionReactor About page. That's usually the front page you come into when you log into it. But we're in the metrics, web metrics. And there's lots of buttons over there, and the buttons have sub-buttons. We're in metrics, web metrics. And this is like the home page, the best place to hang out. And by the way, if you like this and want to have it be what you go to when you open up FusionReactor, you can set it as the home page. This doesn't set your browser's home page. It sets it so that when you come into FusionReactor, if you don't tell it where to go, it goes to whatever page is set as the home page within FusionReactor. Anyway, so this thing is watching this particular server, seeing it get its traffic, and let's just talk quickly about this page, because this is the most important page. You get a real sense of what's going on in your environment just by looking at this page. And in fact, I'll tell you what, rather than show this, because it is kind of silly, let's go to my website. I thought I had that open, but I don't, so let me just open up another tab. I think I do. Yes, there I do. Sorry. Yeah, there you go. Carehart.org. So this is my website, carehart.org. It's just this is a little bit different. This is perhaps more typical. It's getting relatively light load now in the middle of the night. But we can see request activity, we can see database activity, and we can see memory and CPU. Let's start over here because these are relatively easy to understand. So this is showing two things. There's a legend. So the dark yellow is the CPU used inside of ColdFusion. And this is looking at the past minute by default. I can change it to the last hour if I want to. So I just did that. And you see it's just a little bit different. Not that different. But anyway, so here's the last minute. And this is the most recent time on the right, and it's passing by on the left. So we can see up to a minute. And the dark yellow is the CPU within CF. And the light yellow, which is generally above it, is the CPU total on the machine. So at this moment, CF was using 1% of CPU, but something else was using 40%. And let me just tell you, you got to understand that, because sometimes you're going to find that the reason CF's got problem is something else on the machine is stealing resources. People want to blame ColdFusion, but if ColdFusion CPU is 10% and the CPU is like constantly 50, 60, 70% in the light yellow, then there's something else on the machine that's stealing resources. Maybe that's your problem. But anyway, so you can see the use of CPU within CF in the dark yellow. And then the memory, this is a pretty powerful thing, because while other monitoring tools also show you the memory, FusionReactor does something that they don't do. The CF server monitor and CFusion, for those who know about that, they tend to show the used memory and then the top of their y-axis of their chart is the allocated memory. And if you don't understand the difference, you might think you're running out of memory when you're not. Like right here, it's the dark orange says I'm using 280 meg, but I've allocated 512 meg. But my max is around 600 meg. I don't remember what it is exactly, but the point is, in FusionReactor, the top of the y-axis, the top number here, is your max memory, max heap, the heap in the CF administrator. When you set the max heap size, that's what this is. And my server, you know, I've tuned things and solved problems, so I don't need a lot of memory. I can run it 600 meg. Maybe you need 2 gig, 4 gig, 8 gig. But let me just tell you, sometimes you don't. So FusionReactor lets you see how much memory you're really using. And sometimes even in a 4, 6, 8 gig machine, you might see that you're not using more than a few hundred meg. So maybe you didn't really need all that. But that's another subject for another day. The point is you can see the memory use over time. And here you see it growing, growing, growing. And in a moment it's going to go down, because that's what it does. The JVM keeps an eye on things, and it tries to clean up after itself. And that's another subject, understanding garbage collection and all that stuff. But let's just say it is doing some garbage collection. It went down, and now it's rising up. And then it went down, and it's rising up. But you know what? Let me just throw out here, one of the cool things about FusionReactor is you can actually ask it to do a different kind of garbage collection. What it does on its own is generally a minor garbage collection. We can ask it to do a major garbage collection. Now some of you out there think, oh, we're not supposed to do those stop the world. No, my gosh, let's not do that. Well, let's see this thing do its own GC in a moment, because the JVM on its own is going to do a GC in a moment. From what we've observed, it's about every 45, 50 seconds on its own. I didn't tell it to do that. So there it goes. Come on. Boop, there it went. And it fell to what? 255. So 255 meg out of the 700. But there's a garbage collection button here. Let me click on that. And let's see if it can do better. Does it fall even further? It may not. We'll see in a moment when that line appears as it recharts that. It fell a little bit, so not much. But I've worked with people where we've been looking at their machine and they had it set for 4 gig or 6 gig max, and it was humming along at 3 gig or 4 gig, and they thought, yeah, we need that. We really need 6 gig. And I'd say, well, let's click that garbage collection button. And by the way, when I click that garbage collection button right here, we can see that it caused a little spike in CPU, but there was no great corresponding change in performance. Just take my word for it. That rose to 350 milliseconds. So it didn't add that much burden to do the garbage collection. If it was even that, I think actually it was about right there, and I don't think that was even that. So no, there was like virtually no impact. So don't take the word of people who say it always, quotes, stop the world. Theoretically, yes. Practically, not necessarily. Anyway, the point is it fell to about that amount. And so it really is using that amount of memory. But I've worked with people where we did that GC and it was running along at 4 gig and we clicked the button and it fell down to 400 meg. They weren't using 4 gig. They were using 400 meg. But the JVM was being lazy about doing garbage collection. And you don't ever need to click this button. You don't need to keep up after the JVM. It would have done that garbage collection eventually. Sometimes it would let the memory climb and climb and climb, and people freak out thinking, oh my gosh, ColdFusion's running out of memory. But if it climbs and climbs and climbs and then on its own it just drops like a rock, well, it was just being lazy, and it finally got around to doing garbage collection and then it dropped. Or you could say, well, I don't want to wait and see if that's going to happen. Let me just try it right now. And I'm just telling you, I've worked with many people where we click on that button and within seconds it drops hundreds, if not gigs, of memory down to a very low number, and then maybe they didn't really need the memory that they thought they did. Now that's another subject for another day. If it doesn't drop, why does it not drop? If it does run out of memory, why does it run out of memory? We don't have time to get into that today, but I just want you to see that even without talking about running requests or anything like that, FusionReactor can already be of some value to you to understanding some things in your environment. And let me just say too that there's much more to the memory than what we see here. If I come over here to resources, there's memory heap, there's memory heap non-heap, there's different memory spaces. Let me just show you for a second. If I click on this link under here, it changes this from focusing on all 6 graphs in the last minute to this memory graph over several minutes. It looks like it's going back, okay, a minute right now. I can go back an hour and see if it looks any different. I can go back a day, and as long as FusionReactor and ColdFusion have been up, I can keep going back. I can go back a week, and my server has been up that long. And so we can see that in my case, memory's been humming along right around 300 meg on average, so I don't need to worry about memory. But the point is, this is the graph. If I had gone to resources, memory heap, that would have taken me to that graph. But I can also say resources, for those of you that are really into this stuff, I can say resources memory spaces. And now it takes me by default to this survivor space, which may mean something to some of you, may not. But if you take a look, here is the Eden space, and the old gen, and the perm gen, and the survivor space, and the code cache. And some of these may be of interest for you to study. I'll tell you, most people over-focus on this stuff, and it's not as important as they make it out to be. But I'll just throw out that the perm gen is one particular place where if you run out of perm gen, ColdFusion will crash. And that's another whole subject, again, worthy of another discussion. But the point is you can see it and maybe see if over time it's changed. I don't believe on my server it's had any unusual. Yeah, it's been pretty much flatlined. But I've worked with people where we found that that was a problem. PermGen was rising. So I'll say one more time, I went to Resources, Memory Spaces, and then up in the top right corner, there was a drop down. And some screens in FusionReactor have that sort of drop down, so you want to get used to looking at that. So I'm going to go back to metrics, web metrics, because like I said, this is like the home page, this is where to hang out and learn a lot. So we focused on CPU and memory. Now over here, these are about request activity and database activity. And specifically, this one is saying, in dark green, how many requests per second are running. So at this point I had 2 requests per second running. And in the dark blue, it's, well, how long did those take? And so those two averaged about 176 milliseconds. So they were fast. And then you can see some other ones running here, and they were really fast. Okay. So this is running requests and average requests per second, and this is duration of requests. And I'll show you a little more about that in a moment. And then this is database activity. How many queries are there per second? And then how long are those queries taken? Now my server again is pretty lightly loaded right now, so let's go back to that demo. It'll be a little more interesting. So here we can see it's getting on average about 3 requests per second. That's the dark green. And then the light green, the difference is these are running requests. All right, now the difference is requests per second is how many did run. Every 5 seconds this is updating. And the dark green in the top left graph is how many did run on average per second. And it's about 3 per second. Now again, this is some synthetic load, and it's pretty much always flat-lined at that amount. So it's not like it would be in your environment. You might have 4, 5, 10 requests per second, maybe more. You know, you might be surprised. I see people's servers of all sizes every day, and honestly, several requests per second is not, it's not usually much higher than that, even a busy server. And now you might say, well, you're not looking at busy servers. Okay, granted. I'm just saying most people's servers, I see a lot of them, and they are generally doing few to several requests per second. Now the request per second, it's just interesting. It tells you how much activity is on your server. But this light green, that's very important. Whether you have many requests per second or few requests per second, that's really not as important as this light green, which is how many requests are running. All right, so the difference is not how many did run, how many are running at these 5-second intervals. And this is going between 2 and 1, 2 and 1, 2 and 1. So there's always in this server at least a couple requests running. Your server may have none running. You never see any running. You only see them completing because they're completing fast. And that's depicted by this over down here. This is how long they took. And the dark blue is of those that did complete, how long did they take? And you can barely see 512 milliseconds. So on this server, the average request time of the requests that are completing is very small, hundreds of milliseconds. But I said there's this one long-running request. And that long-running request is constantly bringing the light blue, which is the average response time of the running request. That's constantly going up until it completes, and then it drops. And then it starts over again because there's a load testing tool that's sending a request every minute that takes a minute. So anyway, we can see requests taking a long time. We can see if requests are starting to pile up. Usually you won't find any. Sometimes you will. Sometimes that'll be an indication of a problem. And then this tells you the database activity. And on this server, of those 3 requests per second that are running, they do about 15 requests per second of activity, of query activity. And if you divide these numbers, you get about 5 requests per second. So in their environment, their requests are doing about, 5 queries per request. They're doing about 5 queries per request because 15 requests per second of queries divided by 3 requests per second of requests is about 5 queries per request. That can be helpful for you to sometimes to interpret that number and to tell somebody. Anyway, so this is completed queries, how many completed per second, and then the light green is what are running, how many are running. And usually you don't have too many queries running. You might have many completing. Folks I worked with today had about 300 queries per second running. They were doing a lot of queries, but there was never more than 1 or 2 queries running. And they might have had 20 requests per second, but there was rarely more than 1 or 2 requests running at a time. So that might make sense to some of you, it might not. There's a lot to take in here, so we can't guarantee that everybody will understand every word I say, but hopefully it'll all make sense as we start to dive into some things more. The bottom graph is talking about of the queries that ran, how long did they take? The ones that finished, that's dark blue. How long did they take? Those ones that completed, how long did they take? And the light blue is of those that are running, how long are they taking on average? And so again, this is going up because there's a long running query. And now we can see that this long running request is long running because it's got a long running query. So sometimes even without going any further than this graph, you can piece together lots of things to understand what's going on in your environment. And yet this is just the tip of the iceberg of what FusionReactor does and can do for you. So let's just see some of the other cool stuff you can see. When did the server start? What date and time? And how long has it been up? This one's been up 65 days. And if you look at my server, you might think that's crazy, but my server's been up 47 days. So you can have CF servers that stay up for days and weeks, even on Windows. You know, Linux people are thinking, oh, my Linux machines run forever. But even on Windows, ColdFusion can run forever if you solve the problems that keep it from going down. Anyway, you can see other high-level information about how many requests are running, how many total have there been on this server, 15 million in those 65 days. On my server, 500,000 in 47 days. Remember, this is synthetic load being sent every second, a couple requests per second. So that adds up to 15 million pretty quickly. The average request time of those requests, and then things like memory and how many queries have happened, 72 million queries. If you go to my server, I've had 2 million queries over the 500,000 requests. So again, you can see it's about 4 queries per request. So that's all just good stuff, high level, what's going on in the environment. There's some stuff about recent slow pages and recent slow queries, might be of interest to you. But there's much, much more. These may be interesting, I'll leave you to check them out. But this, I really want to focus on. This shows me how many requests have had 200 status codes, how many have had 404s, how many have had 500s. And if we go to that site of mine, it might be still different. So I've got 200s, 301s, 302s, 403s, 404s, 500s, and 503s, and I can see the count of them. Well, not only can I see the count of them, but let's say I was curious about, well, what's been getting 500 internal server errors? I click on that link, and FusionReactor takes me to a page that shows me the pages that had errors. 500s in ColdFusion are errors. So these pages had errors. All right, if I look at these, I might get some idea from looking at them, but I really don't see why these would be bad. I can also see up here when they've happened, because maybe there's some pattern. Maybe they tend to happen at certain times or on a certain interval, or they're clustered around a certain time, but I don't see anything there. Now, one of the really cool things about FusionReactor is I can dig into these requests. So I'm going to click on this one and see what it's about. And I can see not only the URL and how long it took and what IP address it came from, but I can see other stuff like how many bytes were sent, the data transfer rate, time to first byte, time to last byte. Good stuff. How many queries happened, if any. That one didn't have any, but sometimes you'll find yours do. How much CPU time was spent on the request. Now that was 647 milliseconds, of which 546 were CPU time. That might be interesting. That request had some kind of relatively high rate of CPU usage. But let's keep going. I can see the headers, I can see the cookies, I can see the queries, I can see lots of cool stuff, including, check this out, if the page had an error, I can see what the error was. All right, so this one had an error, undefined WC session cook. I have no idea what that's about, but I can see that it was in a custom tag called, or a CFC stored in the custom tags directory called portcullis. Some of you may know what that is. It's a web application firewall for ColdFusion, free. If you haven't heard of it, check it out. Google portcullis and you'll find it. Anyway, it seemed to have had an error at line 109 of its code, and this was the error. And so I could look into that and find out that's what it's about. But the cool thing is, you see, I can see the error. I don't need to have an error handler set up to email me. I don't have to have been the user that got the error. FusionReactor will tell me a page had an error. Here's the error. Go look into it. Here's the line of code. Go knock yourself out. And it'll keep that information for as long as ColdFusion stays up and running. And so I can see errors going back days, 17th, 16th, 15th, 14th, 13th, 12th, 11th. You know, I'll just pick this one and see what its error was. And that had some other servlet exception, parsing a query string. I don't see what's wrong with that, but sometimes you'll be able to make sense of it. Sometimes you won't be able to necessarily do anything with it. But anyway, that was the status codes page, and that was looking at the 500s. Maybe you'd be interested in looking at your 404s. What pages are being requested that got 404s? Let me show you a couple examples there. If I pick a 404 page and wait for the graph to come up, and again, I don't see any particular pattern. They seem kind of random. And I'll pick something that looks weird, like, well, this, you know, call to the JSP, connector JSP FCK editor. It's trying to call a file that fortunately was not found. Maybe I'll be wondering, who'd this come from? Well, there's the IP address. Maybe that's not enough. Let me look at the headers. What user agent was it? It was Googlebot. So somehow Google has a link to this page, and so they're probably going to be coming often. Now, let me just throw out there, that's if this is legitimately Google. It's totally reasonable, not reasonable, but possible that a bad guy who's trying to break in will say in his headers that he's Google to throw me off the trail. So you can't 100% trust these. That might not really be Google. So you might want to investigate that. You could take the IP address and look it up, and sometimes it'll say whether it's Google or not. IP addresses can be spoofed as well. So you don't want to put too much stock in all this stuff, but it points you in the right direction. And the point is that I can also see that there's no referrer, for those who know what that means. If there was a referrer, and if it was a URL on my website, then this 404 is coming from a mistake in my site. The referrer page would be where the link was. The user clicked the link, came to this page, but they came from the referrer page. But if there's no referrer, then that means they didn't come from a page on my site, and it probably was either a user typing in a URL and hitting enter, or a spider or a bot or a hacker calling the URL directly. They're just calling this URL directly. It doesn't exist. It got a 404. It got handled, got detected. Anyway, so that's cool stuff. So we were back on the front page, the high-level details about your environment. And we've seen some things, but let's now go back to this server that's got the synthetic load. And let's say you happen to be looking at your server and you see, oh my goodness, look, I've got a long-running request. Why is that request taking so long? Well, if you go to Requests, Activity, that shows any currently running request. Now, as soon as I opened it, there was a request that was taking 200 milliseconds and one taking 45 seconds. Let me refresh the page, and I'll bet the one that took 200 will be gone. And it is, and there's the one that was taking 60 seconds. Now, I know this thing refreshes every 60 seconds, so I'm going to refresh it and it's going to be gone. But it's going to start up again. So it's already 9 seconds into its next iteration. So the point is, this is a long-running request. And FusionReactor is saying, when I came into this display, there were these two requests running. I might have had a bunch of other requests that did run, but these two were running. Now, before I dig into this, I want to repeat that point. Look, I'm getting 3 requests per second. I only see 2 of them here. There's a lot of requests running that I'm not seeing. If I look at the requests history, that shows me what requests did run. So on the server, wherever the server is, it's 1742. And here, just in the past several seconds, there have been like 10 requests. So don't think just because you don't see anything in the request activity that nothing's going on your server. There's a lot of requests running all the time. But when you go to requests activity, you want to focus on if there's any that's there that's taking a long time. And again, I caught it right at 59 seconds. I'll refresh it, and it'll be a few seconds into its life. So again, there's this automatically rerunning request, in this case of the synthetic load. But yours might be a real long-running request from a real user. And the point is, what do you want to do about it? Well, I've shown you could look at the details. So on any request, you can click on it and see this kind of stuff. You can see the IP address. You can see if queries have been run already. If there's a currently running query, that wouldn't be there. But if we go to this JDBC tab, that shows what queries have run, what are running. Here's running queries. Here's completed queries. So this particular request had already done a select statement of these 2 columns from this table, and it took this long to run and brought back this many records. It happened also to be running this query, and it has been taking 19 seconds at the time I clicked on this. If I refresh the page, I might catch it still running. It's probably finished. Oh, right at 59 seconds. So if I go to the JDBC tab, we caught it right at the last second, and there was that thing. Now, you look at the SQL statement and go, I don't get that. Well, this isn't a legitimate one that you would do. This is, again, a synthetic load, and they've put in a SQL Server specific select statement that says, go to sleep for a minute. So the database got the query, went to sleep. ColdFusion's waiting for that database. But you might do your own SQL statement that queries a bunch of tables or queries one table and has a bad index, or whatever, something's wrong and the query takes a long time. Well, you could see by coming into FusionReactor that query took a long time. And that could be helpful for you to go figure out, why is that query taking a long time. So I'm going to back up because I know this request is already finished. There's no point in looking at it anymore. I'm going to refresh the page. and see how long it's into its life. 56 seconds. I'll let it go ahead and finish, and I'm going to do one more thing. Let's say you have a long-running request and you don't see it running a query, and therefore you don't know why it's taking a long time. You wonder, why is it taking a long time? Well, here's another really powerful feature of FusionReactor that many people who've used it for months or years don't know that exists. On this request, rather than dig into it to see if it's running a particular query, I can do what's called a stack trace, this little button here. I can click on that button, and that says to the JVM and to FusionReactor, hey, ask JVM to ask ColdFusion to ask that request, what are you doing? Right now, what line of code are you on? And now these stack traces, when you first see them, they look like gibberish, and you may not know what to make of them, but it doesn't take long to figure them out. I can tell, because I use these all the time, that this is running this line of code. This stack trace is telling us that that line of code was running at the moment I said, what are you doing? Here's what he was doing. Now, the reason I know that's what the line was is if you start at the top and work your way down, that's the first thing that refers to a CFM or a CFC. So at the moment this CF page was running, it was on line 25 of FRJDBC2.CFM. Isn't that amazing? If you've never seen that, if you have a long-running request and you're wondering why is that taking so long, you just stack trace it. And with a little bit of experience, you learn how to go, oh, it's line 25 of FRJDBC2.CFM. Let's go look into that. Here's the full path to the code. And of course, your path may be different. You may be on Linux. You may have your code in inetpub, www, whatever. It doesn't matter. Wherever it is, if it's in a custom tags directory, if it's in a mapping, doesn't matter. Wherever it is, you're going to see in FusionReactor the real path to the file. And if you're on the server, you could just highlight that file and path, copy to the clipboard, open up the file, do an edit, go to line 25, and boom, there's whatever the line of code was it was running. Now, you also can learn eventually you don't even need to look at the code. You have everything you need right here to know what that line 25 was doing. And if we were in a group where I could talk to, I'd ask if anybody knew. But let me just tell you, once you find the line of code that it's running, again, you read stack traces from the top down. So once we find this line 25, well, what that turned into was this line above it, line 533. But that's not important. Here's what's important. It's a ColdFusion tag, query tag.doEnd tag. Right? That means that's a closing CF query tag. Line 25 is a closing CF query tag. Now you might think that means, oh, it's moving on to the next line of code. No, it means do the query. And in fact, that turned into this Java method that said query tag, execute the query. And that turned into, hey, SQL implementation, execute the query. And that turned into, hey, executive, execute the query. And that ultimately led to, hey, SQL Server, go execute the query. And then it did whatever it did to ultimately be waiting for the database to provide its response. So in the moment we said, what are you doing? He was running line 25, and line 25 had turned into these various Java things, and this is what it was doing at the moment. The top one was waiting for the database to give it a response. And when it gave it a response, it would go to this read method, and when it finished, it would go to this method and back down to this. And if it was done with the query, it would move on to the next line of code. Now, we don't see here what the next line of code is. We only see at the moment, what's he doing? That's the line of code he was running. And that's it. And if there was like a call to an application CFM or CFC, we might see that later on down here too, because the application CFM or CFC then called the CF page, and the CF page eventually ran this line of code, and this is what it's doing from that point up. Now, when you do the stack trace like this, you're just seeing a point in time. At that moment, it's saying that's what it did. And with a little bit of experience, you can pretty much figure this out in about 5 seconds and go, okay, that's what that request is doing. Well, once you found that out, you don't really want to stop there, because you don't know how long it's been doing that, and you don't know that it's been doing it for a long time. You just know that at the moment you said, hey, what are you doing? He said, I'm on line 25. To know if he's really been on that line for a long time, we have to refresh the stack trace. Now, if I just refresh the page, we're going to see it give us an error message or a message that says, hey, that request doesn't live anymore. It was running, but it's not running anymore. And you can't stack trace a request that isn't running. It doesn't make any sense. So let's go back instead to the list of running requests. I'm going to refresh it. Let's see how many seconds into its life it is. 36 seconds. I'm going to do the stack trace. I got about 24 seconds to figure this out before I know it's going to end. So there it is on line FRJDBC to line 25. And I'm going to refresh this. and it's not yet finished, so there was no message at the top, and it's still sitting on line 25 of FR JDBC2. So then I could say, I got a smoking gun. That request was there, and then 10 seconds later when I refreshed it, it's still there. There's our problem. Let's go figure out what that's about. And sometimes when you've got long-running requests displayed in that interface and you wonder what they're doing, this will tell you that's what it's doing. And then you go figure it out. What's the problem? What tag is it? Maybe you'll find it's a CF HTTP tag. Maybe it's calling some third-party server, and the CF page is stuck on the CF HTTP waiting for a response. It's not getting it. Well, that thread, that CF request, is now basically out of commission until it gets its response. Well, let's say that happens in not only this request, but another request and another request. Maybe it's a big part of your application. Well, it could be that eventually this page is full of requests that are taking hundreds of seconds, and when you stack trace them, they're all doing CF HTTPs. Well, there's your problem. Go figure out why that third-party server is not responding. There's your problem, not ColdFusion. ColdFusion's the victim. And I don't have an example here right now, but on my website, I do believe, let me just do a quick create a test page. I want to demonstrate that and show you something in particular. So I know you can't see my screen right now. That's okay. I'm going to kick off a long-running HTTP request. Okay, so now I'm going to go to my server, carehart.org, and we're going to see that now all of a sudden, where everything had been cool and copacetic and nothing ever running very long, suddenly I got a long-running request. And it's one or two requests that are running, taking a long time, going up, 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 and they're going to last for 60 seconds. Now, if I go to my requests activity, I'll see there's a invoke CF HTTP. So I'm going to click on that page, and it is doing a CF HTTP. And if I do the stack trace, we'll see that it says it's doing line 12 of invoke a CF HTTP that waits, and it's calling HTTP tag do end tag. All right, so this request is doing a CF HTTP. And if I refreshed it and it was still doing that for a long time, there would be my answer to my question. But I want to show you something else FusionReactor can tell you. If I click on this and go to relations, here I can see the CF HTTP taking 55 seconds also. So FusionReactor not only tracks database calls, but it also tracks HTTP calls. So I don't even have to stack trace it to see that it's stuck doing a CF HTTP. That's a cool thing about FusionReactor. And I can see here the URL that was called. So let's be clear. This is the page that did the CF HTTP. This is where that CF HTTP called to. And in your environment, that might be some third-party server, like a payment gateway or something like that, weather service, who knows. But you'd have the URL here and how long it took. And you could take that information and say, run it yourself and say, hey, yeah, when I run it, it also goes slow. Well, no wonder ColdFusion's slow. It's waiting for that to finish. So that's a cool feature of FusionReactor to be able to see the HTTP processing. All right, let's try to wrap up FusionReactor real quick in the remaining several minutes, and then we'll move on to FusionAnalytics. And by the way, Daniel, go ahead and chime in. Do you guys typically take a break at 8 for a few minutes and then come back? Keep on rolling. No, I'm cool. Okay, cool. Thank you, sir. All right, so we were looking at metrics, web metrics, and that's pretty much all we need to see of that, and looking at running a request. Hope you find that valuable. In fact, let me just go ahead and stop since we're taking a little moment. Anybody have any questions or comments on what we've seen so far? Okay. So that's really valuable to be able to see what's going on in the moment. Why is a request taking a long time? Go ahead. Okay. Okay, man. So I'm going to go back to my server, which has more realistic load on it. Let me show you that there's also requests. Now, some people find this on their own, longest request. This is the longest request that have run on my CF server since it came up, which in my case was 40 days ago. But in your case, it might be hours or days ago. And so this is in sorted duration order. What were the longest running requests? These are milliseconds, so these are thousands of seconds, and that's certainly dismaying to see that there's some requests taking thousands of seconds. And I might want to explore them. If I click on this URL, I can see there was 39 queries. They took a total of 3 seconds, so that doesn't explain 2,000 seconds. So whatever my problem was, it wasn't query processing. I can look at the relations and see if there's any CF HTTP in there, or if anything is long. I'll just look down the list on the right. Nope, I don't see anything. So, and this would show the top 30 slowest things. So I didn't have that. So sometimes you can't tell by looking at this what it is. Now here's an example where if I wanted to, if this was happening at a time when a lot of requests were going slow, I could have told FusionReactor to watch for when a bunch of requests are running slow and send me an email. I mentioned this earlier. I could have been sent an email that said, hey, back at this time, here were these requests running slow. And in the email, it would say, here's the URLs, here's the IP address, and it would have in it what's called the stack traces, the thread dump, which is all the stack traces of all the threads. And it's a pretty big email, a couple thousand lines, but the point is I could look at it and do the same thing I just did. I could say, well, find me a request that was running long, let me get its thread ID, find its stack trace in the email, and there it would be, just like the stack trace we were just looking at. And I would say, oh, that's why that request was taking a long time. So we can't tell by here looking at it, but we can tell if we had an alert set up. So that's the value of the alerts. So anyway, this was the longest requests. But I wanted to stress that while that seems to be what some people focus on, and maybe you'll find some common running, long running requests to fix, maybe more valuable is to look at slow requests. Slow requests. So the difference is, longest request is the 100 longest requests since CF came up. Slow requests is the 100 most recent requests that were slow. All right, so it focuses on what was slow recently. And so I know on my server right now it's about 1956, and I just had that HTTP that was slow, and it called this page, which was slow. And then before that, about 4 hours earlier, I had this page that was slow, and before that, seconds earlier, 2 seconds earlier, so there might be some interesting connection between those. And then before that, hours before, and then I actually start going back into days ago. And in fact, I can say by looking at this screen that I've only had about 10 slow pages in the past 2 days, and I would feel pretty good about that. And isn't that helpful? I want you to appreciate that. Don't focus on the graphs and the charts only. Sometimes you could look at this list and say to somebody, hey, our server has only had like 10 slow requests in the past 2 days. 10, and then how many have been run? You could look at that interface and figure it out. Or let me just tell you, every request gets an ID, and this is the request ID. So if I look back to the, we'll say the 16th or the 15th, the last request on the 15th was 550375, and this most recent one was 590805, so 5502, that's 40,000 requests. I've had 40,000 requests since the 16th, of which about 8 were slow. I would say I'm doing pretty good. 8 slow requests out of 40,000. Okay, so slow in FusionReactor is by default 8 seconds. So if a request is 8 seconds or slower, it shows up in this list. So that's more valuable, I think, sometimes than looking at the longest running requests. Look at what's been slow recently and see if there isn't anything to be gained from that. And I might find, for instance, if I look at this IP address, that kind of looks like a spider. Let's see. I'll go to headers. And the user agent is Yahoo Slurp. So, sometimes these slow requests, they're not even real people. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't focus on them, but don't go freaking out that all your users are getting slow requests, because you might find out, no, it's spiders and bots, and they have their own reasons why sometimes they can have slow requests. We don't have time to get into that now, but just keep that in mind. Sometimes you might find that when you look in here. Okay, so that was requests, slow requests. And there's lots more we could cover, but let me skip down and show some more things. I talked earlier about how if the memory was high and you did a GC and it didn't drop much, something's holding on to memory. Well, if we could talk, I would ask you, what might hold on to memory beyond the life of a request? Somebody might guess it. A common thing is sessions. So you might have lots of sessions. Some people don't know how many sessions they have. Well, FusionReactor can tell you. Under metrics, custom series. Here's how many sessions I have right now, 200. 200 is not bad. I've worked with people that had 2,000, 20,000, 100,000, and more. And you might go, holy smokes, why would you have 100,000 sessions? And especially if they thought they only had like 100. That's a problem. So that's another subject for another day. How do you have 200,000 sessions? It can happen. But the point is, FusionReactor can tell you. And we can look at it over time and see if there's any pattern. And sure enough, somehow in the past, 20 minutes, there's been a rise in sessions. I suspect some spider is crawling through my site. Let's see if that has kind of a periodic nature. It's pretty unusual. This is a day, and it's like all kinds of different stuff. And let's look at a week. But you might find things to look very different. Some people, I see their servers go up and down in nice, wavy, one-day patterns. Mine is very varied, and I suspect that's just lots of different spiders hitting my site all the time. And spiders tend to create a new session on every page request. Again, we don't have time to get into that, but that can sometimes happen. So great stuff. Let me just show you too the JDBC. I can see any currently running queries. I can see any recently run queries. These are the 100 most recently run queries, all the queries that have happened on my server. I can see what have been the longest running queries, what have been the most recent slow queries. So here again, we're looking back all the way to November 11th. So, I mean, I have 8 days worth of requests, of which, about 15 have been slow of a few seconds, none more than a few seconds. I feel pretty good about that. And if I look at these numbers, it looks like I've done about 3 million queries in those 3 days. So I'd feel good about those numbers. So that's good stuff. There's much more we could cover. I don't have time, but I want to talk quickly about setting up crash protection. So if I click on this protection button, I can say, and I have on my server, I've said, if I ever have 15 requests running over a period of 5 seconds, send me an email. So you tell it, if I have 15 requests running for 5 seconds, send me an email. Remember, we looked at my metrics, web metrics, and I didn't usually have more than a couple requests running. Here there's 1 request running, the light green. But on your server, if we go back to this demo server, there was 1 or 2 requests running all the time. Well, if this server ever got up to 5 or 10 or 15, we'd want to know about it. And that's what that alert's about. And it just sends you an email. And there's other things about configuring it. There's more about that in the online documentation. I want to go ahead and move on from this and talk about a couple things. I mentioned the logs. You don't want to miss it. There's tremendous logs. You can see logs inside of FusionReactor. If you go to this FusionReactor button and choose logs, you can see the most recent 128K worth of logs. Not all of the logs, but here's the resource log. And this basically tracks everything that's in that metrics, web metrics. It tracks memory, CPU, request activity, and database activity. And these logs are also stored in the file system where ColdFusion and FusionReactor are installed. And I could look back at this over hours, days, weeks, and by default up to 30 days. Now you might wonder when you look at these logs, well, how am I supposed to know what these columns are? Well, you go to FusionReactor Help. And that takes you to a new page, which is the FusionReactor Online Help. And in a moment, we'll see on the left the various guides in the FusionReactor documentation. There's an installation guide, a user guide, monitoring queries, troubleshooting server problems, using the protection features, and on and on and on. Good stuff. Well, if I look at the user guide, here's logging, and here's overview of FusionReactor logs. And here are all the logs that are in the FusionReactor display, in the FusionReactor logs, and I happen to be looking just then at the resource log. That's a really valuable log to look at. And there's the help for the resource log, and it tells me what each column is, what its relative number is. If I import it into Excel, I can see what the number would be in Excel, and then a description. And by the way, speaking of Excel, if you want to, if you just come in here and type Excel in the help of FusionReactor, it takes you to a page which talks about importing FusionReactor logs into Excel or OpenOffice Calc. And it's very simple, 8 steps, and you could pull one of these logs in and bam, you can do a graph of your own. So it may be something that happened hours ago or days ago or before a crash. So that's great. All right. I think that's there. One more thing I want to show you. On this server, we can see it if I go to user experience. This is another feature added in FusionReactor 5, I believe it was, where FusionReactor by default has always tracked this red part, which is how long is a request running in the database, and the blue part, which is what's the total request time, and of that the database is a subset. But then what about the network time, sending the request down to the client? And then what about the browser render time? Well, we didn't have that in FusionReactor, but now you can. It's called user experience monitoring, and when you add just a single line of code to your ColdFusion pages, it sends JavaScript down to the browser. When the browser executes it, it sends a response back to the server, and then it allows it to track things like this. So we can see how much time is spent sending stuff down over the network, how much time is spent rendering pages in the browser. And not only in aggregate like this, but also if I look at the requests, I'll pick slow requests because they live a little bit longer. And I'll look at a recent slow request and look at the details. And I don't look as often at this user experience time. I can't find it right now, but there is some place in here where it's tracked as a column. I don't see it in there. And I'm sorry, I just at the moment can't remember where that is. But the point is you can see how much time is being spent in the sending the data down to the network. And let me just tell you, you're going to want to learn more about that if that interested you. I'm going to collapse this user guide, and there's a whole guide to it called User Experience Monitoring. It's not very big, but it talks about putting the JavaScript into your code, and there's examples in CFML. There's a ColdFusion example right there. You just put this set of code in your template, probably like in your application CFM or CFC would be a typical place to put it, and that'll put this tracking script on every page that'll get sent down to the browser, and it'll come back to the server and tell how long was spent doing that stuff. So that's user experience monitoring. I'll say again, if you come back to the FusionReactor website, you can find out about all the features. There's a mobile app for viewing things. I didn't mention it, but there's an enterprise dashboard. You can watch multiple servers at once. Let me just do that real quick. I'll come to my FusionReactor dashboard. I happen to have it in called my Fram instance. I won't discuss the distinction about that for now. But if I go to my Fram instance and its enterprise dashboard, I have it set to watch multiple machines. I thought I had a, oh no, sorry, I looked at the wrong ones. Sorry, I meant to look at the one on my local machine. There you go. So here's my enterprise dashboard on my local machine, and when I look at the dashboard, I've got it set up to watch many different servers, my CF10 servers, my local servers, my Careheart.org server, even the FusionReactor Live demo. So this is a single dashboard that lets me see multiple machines running at once, and I can see them individually or I can group them. So I've created a group of my CF10 servers, a group of my local machines, and if a particular server is offline, like this particular server wasn't online, so when I first would have added it, it would have given me this error saying it couldn't connect because it's not online right now. I have that instance of CF9 stopped. Well, I don't have to suffer it turning red all the time. I can just say, no, stop paying attention to him. He's offline. But anyway, so this one was running, and when I click on an instance, I can see pretty much the same stuff that was in the metrics web metrics page, but I see it on a single high-level page. And this is memory, CPU request, and database activity. And as those goes up, these pipes go up. And the blue turns orange or red as things get worse. And this one is red because it's got that long-running database query. And it's almost finished, so at a moment we'll see that pipe go down. It'll momentarily turn blue, but then it'll slowly turn orange because the database, we know that query takes 60 seconds. So anyway, if I click on it, we can see that activity going on down here. So that's the FusionReactor Enterprise Dashboard. Really powerful way to watch multiple servers at once. So I meant to really just say, there's a lot more you could learn about. Come back and visit the website, see the features pages, read the blog, watch the videos. There's video tutorials. If I go to support, there's video tutorials here. And I always showed you the docs. Great stuff. So let me move back to wrap up about FusionReactor, and then we'll move on to FusionAnalytics and FusionDebug. So where do you learn more? I'll show you in a moment. In fact, then we'll get to FusionAnalytics and FusionDebug. So yeah, there you go. Sorry, I meant to go to this earlier. And now, so we can watch what's going on now. We can see historically to the restart of CF or up to a week. We can see the logs to view what went on before crashes, to look at trends. We can see the alerts to be notified before an outage, and to give you details to solve a problem. So it's not just an interface, it's also the logs and the alerts. Really powerful stuff. And we're going to move on to FusionAnalytics and FusionDebug in a moment, but just for those who are intrigued about FusionReactor, if you want to buy it, let me just tell you about it. It's licensed per server, physical or virtual. So if you have multiple instances of ColdFusion, or if you have ColdFusion and Railo, or ColdFusion and Tomcat, or Tomcat and JBoss, whatever, one license covers you on that server for whatever you have in there. It's per server. And it's the Enterprise edition of FusionReactor that gives you the dashboard. So that dashboard we saw, that's in the Enterprise version of FusionReactor. And that's really the only difference between FusionReactor Enterprise and FusionReactor Standard. So to be clear, the Enterprise Standard distinction on FusionReactor has nothing to do with the Enterprise Standard distinction of ColdFusion. So if you run ColdFusion Enterprise, you could use FusionReactor Standard. If you run ColdFusion Standard, you might want to use FusionReactor Enterprise. The Enterprise edition of FusionReactor gives you that dashboard. And I didn't say it or show it, but the dashboard can also be accessed via mobile devices. So there's free mobile apps for iOS and Android, tablets or phones. And you could have that same display I showed you in the FusionReactor dashboard. You could see that on your mobile device. There's also an Air dashboard, which some of you might remember. Air was an Adobe thing called Adobe Integrated Runtime. They still have it. And FusionReactor has an Air dashboard, so it runs on your desktop. And it can sit in your status tray. And when it detects an Enterprise dashboard turning orange or red, it would pop up right in front of you without you having to open a browser. The Air dashboard would just pop up and show you, oh, here's a problem with the server. So anyway, that's the dashboard in its web, mobile, and Air-based forms. That's what you get with the Enterprise edition of FusionReactor. Otherwise, everything else I talked about is in the Standard edition. And you can either buy it one time permanently, or you can subscribe to it annually. And the annual price per month is like $24 or $39 a month for Standard or Enterprise. So it's not expensive. Some of you are like, oh my goodness, I didn't know it was that inexpensive. Yeah, it's that inexpensive. So it's great stuff for 24 bucks a month. I think everybody ought to have it. And that price, the annual lease, includes maintenance. So if there's any updates to FusionReactor while you're licensing it, subscribing to it, you get them for free. If you buy it outright, it's $7.99 for the Standard edition, $12.99 for the Enterprise edition. Again, that's per server. So if you have only one server, you just pay this once, and that's it. You never pay again. And that includes a year of maintenance with options to renew that for a small annual fee. And that would, again, get you any updates that came out. Speaking of which, let me just tell you guys that 5.2.4 is the current release of FusionReactor. So if you're on 5.2.3 or earlier, or certainly 5.1 or 5.0 or 4.5 or 4.0, you ought to update. And it's free if you're within the year of your having bought it. And it's definitely worth doing because the new versions always are adding features, they're improving features, they're fixing little bugs. Not a lot of bugs, but little things get tweaked along the way. So definitely check it out, 5.2.4. If you have it, you just download it. In fact, let me show you real quick. If you have FusionReactor installed, you just go to the FusionReactor About page, FusionReactor About page. And here it tells you what version you're on. I happen to be myself on 5.2.3. And if you click on this check for updates, it sends to their server a URL with your version number. And it's saying, oh, you had 5.2.3, there's a 5.2.4. Come download it. And it knows my license, and it says that I am legitimately able to get that for download for free. And I just click on this and download it. And if I was on the server, I would save that exe to the server, and I would run it. And again, within minutes, it would update FusionReactor, restart ColdFusion, and bam, I'd be on the new release. So definitely check it out. And I want to point out as well that the folks who make FusionReactor, Integral, again is the company name, Integral, they're also Adobe resellers. So you can buy ColdFusion at discount from them. They even have a deal, which I think is in the remaining couple weeks of November, that if you're on CF8, you can upgrade to CF11 Adobe wasn't offering anything like that. So that's a nice thing. If you're needing to get from CF8 to CF11, check that out. And to find out more about it, just go out to the website of FusionReactor.com. Remember, we were here in the top right corner. There's the sales address and there's the phone number. It's a US number. You can call it, and folks will answer it at certain times of day. The folks in Germany will answer. Other times of day, the folks in California will answer it. So how do you learn more about FusionReactor? Well, first of all, again, you can get a free trial. It's 14 days. You just go to that download page like I talked about. There's the live online demo. Like I said, you can run it anytime. There's the documentation. We've seen that. It's at the FusionReactor website. There's an installation guide that tells you everything you need to know to get started. And then we've seen there are many more resources on the many features of FusionReactor. I've tried to give you about 50% of what you could do, but there's another 50% I'll leave it to you to learn more about on your own. If you want to get support for it, there's free installation support. You just email support@fusion-reactor.com and you'll get help, generally within a day. And there's a mailing list. It's a Google group. I'm on it. The engineers are on it. Sales folks, everybody's on it. So if you have any questions, you can get answers. You can learn a lot by hanging out on the list. And it's a very low volume list. You might get a few messages a week typically. So don't worry about it burdening your mailbox. It's a great group. And then you can also buy support. I mentioned that. Or consulting. So consulting is to help you solve troubleshooting problems with ColdFusion. Support is if you're having some unusual problem using FusionReactor and it's not really installation support, you don't know how to use a feature and you need help using that feature, then that's where there's support available to help you get that going. But then consulting is available to solve problems with ColdFusion or Railo or your Java Enterprise server. So you can learn more about support at a link on the page called support. And if you click on the link there for consulting, you'll find you get taken to a site called cfconsultant.com. So that's just another website of Integral, and it focuses on ColdFusion troubleshooting. But it can also help with FusionReactor and Java server consulting. All right, so that's it for FusionReactor. Again, we got 45 minutes, right? Half hour, 45 minutes is about the time frame you're expecting that we have left. Is about the time, yeah. Okay. So, and any questions about FusionReactor before I move on? Yeah, please. Nope. 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 It's a great question. I'm sorry I didn't think to write it down and state it. There is virtually no overhead. And I know you may find that hard to believe. For all that it does, you might think, no way. Yes, way. There's virtually no overhead. I mean, the tool is about 8 years old. It's been in use in hundreds of thousands of shops, and if there were any problems, they've been vetted. And there have been over the years little features here or there that maybe cause problems, and they've been fixed so that they don't. And you asked if there's any tweaks. I just want to say no. Out of the box, you don't have to do anything. Out of the box, it will not add any overhead. Virtually none. And there are some features, if you try to turn them on, it might warn you with a pop-up box saying, hey, that feature will add some overhead. Be aware of that, which is nice because the CF server monitor, some of you know about that. If you turn on the memory tracking feature on that, it could be shows over for your server, and there's no warning. And it might not happen immediately, but I heard the laugh. You know what I'm talking about. It might happen within minutes. It might happen within hours. But they ought to warn you, but they don't. It just, it's on your own. So, no, there's virtually nothing that you need to worry about with FusionReactor. You install it out of the box. It's meant to be used in production. Absolutely. Meant to be used in production. Any other question? All right, cool. Well, now FusionAnalytics, what's that about? So I just got through talking about how FusionReactor has all these great logs and how you can see what's going on in FusionReactor up to a day or a week before, unless CF's restarted. Well, if CF's restarted at 2 o'clock today, FusionReactor won't show anything before 2 o'clock because that's just the way it works. It runs, let me just say, I didn't get into this early, but it runs inside the JVM along with ColdFusion. Now that might sound like a bad idea, but it's a good idea. It gets you access to things that you couldn't get otherwise. That's why it does things that New Relic can't do. So anyway, and the server monitor works the same way. CFusion works the same way. They all run inside the JVM. That gives them access to great stuff. But if CF goes down, FusionReactor goes down with it. So what if you wanted to look at what was going on beforehand? Well, I told you you could look at the logs. And in fact, even if CF doesn't go down, I told you the logs are up to 30 days. Well, what if you wanted to watch how things looked over the past 30 days? Or the past month, 2 months, or quarter, or year? Well, this is FusionAnalytics' job. It's a separate tool that you buy, and it has nothing to do with Google Analytics. And it's not about business analytics. It's about understanding your ColdFusion server. Everything that FusionReactor tracks and logs, FusionAnalytics takes and pushes into a database. So that's its job. FusionAnalytics is a tool that you get. It's separately purchased. You get it. You put it on a machine. Doesn't need to be on the server. Doesn't need to be on the same machine. Doesn't need to be in the same network. It could be on your home machine. It could be on your work machine under your desk. It could be anywhere you want. It just sits there eating FusionReactor logs. So once you install it, you point FusionReactor to it and say, hey, FusionReactor, when you create your logs every hour, push them down to FusionAnalytics. Don't just keep them in the logs on ColdFusion server. Push them down to FusionAnalytics. And so every hour, FusionAnalytics gets the logs, and it eats the logs, and it pushes them into a database, which is, could be on the same machine as FusionAnalytics, could be on your network, as on your database server. It's just a table in a database, whatever you want. It's just a database somewhere on your environment, and that database will hold the diagnostic data about your ColdFusion environment, including everything that was logged by FusionReactor. And let me throw out also, FusionReactor tracks the ColdFusion outlog, if you know what that is, and that outlog has great diagnostic information in it, and it keeps it also in an archive every hour, and that gets pushed down to FusionAnalytics, and that gets stored, and you can sometimes look at FusionAnalytics and see what was going on the server at a time in the past and associate it with a log that ColdFusion created. Anyway, so FusionAnalytics eats these logs, pushes them in a database, and specifically with respect to the FusionReactor logs, it puts them in the database and it rolls them up. So it not only puts in the database the fact that there were 10 requests per second during the past minute, it puts every request that was in there, every request, every URL, every how long it took, what IP address, it's all in there. But then it rolls up how many were that per minute, how many were that per hour, how many was that per day, per week, per month, per quarter, per year. And it just does that while it's pushing the data in the database, and you'll see why in a moment. But it's doing all that, chewing up the data, spitting it into the database, tidying it up with some nice, quantizing, if you know what that means. And that's its first job. Then its second job is to present an interface, and that interface is what you would typically use. And let's go ahead and take a look at it. On the FusionAnalytics website, here's the FusionAnalytics website. It's fusion-analytics.com. You can learn all about it. There is a live demo, and I'll go ahead and take a look at that live demo. So this is the FusionAnalytics demo of that demo FusionReactor server we were looking at. So this is what FusionAnalytics looks like. And you might say, well, it looks like FusionReactor. What's the big deal? Well, there's a bunch of big deals. This is just a start. So the first big deal is that it's got this nifty set of widgets down here for manipulating the time. So I'm going to play with that. And so we're currently looking at from 3:15 to 6:15 today. That's the time frame we're looking at here. 3:15 to 6:15 today. There's 3:15 to 6:15-ish. 6:15 there. I'm going to zoom out. And instantly, the graphs are updated. And now I'm looking at November 16th to November 23rd. I'm looking at a week. And so here's the graph of what went on during the week. Now again, you might go, okay, a big deal. I'm not going to pay a lot of money for that. Well, hold your horses. I can go out, zoom out even further. And now I'm looking at November 4th to December 4th. So the whole month. And I might see some interesting changes in patterns that I might want to explore. What's up with that? Now there's much more to this than meets the eye. I just want you to see that you can do that sort of zooming in and out. I can zoom in as well. And I want you to see again that when I zoom in, the graphs update almost immediately. And again, that's because the data is already in the database. This is not having to do a bunch of chewing through, database records to come up with these graphs. The data's already been rolled up to that, what we're now looking at a hour. Now we're looking at 1329. Sorry there, it's just taking a moment to zoom in. So now we're looking at 1615 to 1715. We're now into an hour, and I could zoom in again, and we would be, down to probably a 15-minute interval. So anyway, that's the point, is you can zoom in, zoom out, and it's great. Now, again, if that's all it did, you might go, yeah, so what, big deal. Well, notice there's also information being tracked down here. So I can see during this, 10-minute period, during this 10-minute period, there were 32 requests that took an average of 22 seconds. Remember those really long-running requests that simulated load? So I can see that sort of thing. But there's much, much, much more. Much, much, much more. So first of all, I can go into what's called deep server analysis. And so I can say, let's zoom out to like a little more interesting time frame, like, a day. So I'm looking at 1615 to 715, and now I'm looking at 4 a.m. on the 19th to 4 a.m. on the 20th. Okay, so I'm looking at a day. Well, check out all these things that are in here. This is where FusionAnalytics is much more than FusionReactor is. Some of it's the same, but some of it's definitely not. So I can see, well, during that time, what were the slowest requests? That FusionReactor could do that too. Although, again, I can look at this days ago or weeks ago. But in that particular day, what were the slowest requests? And again, it pretty much comes up instantly because the data is already in the database. And on that day, here were the slowest requests at this time. Now, again, in this situation, it's a synthetic load. These are not changing. They're not really very interesting to you. But your server might look very different. But I can look at not just the slowest request, but what were the slowest on average? Now, again, on this synthetic server, it's not going to really be interesting because there's only a few requests. But it's saying that the slowest on average with 500 executions of about a minute per on average was this add user. And then, there's this other stuff. So anyway, you can see some interesting things going on in the server, and you might want to explore that. There's slowest database request on average, longest request, highest database row count. That's kind of interesting. What have been the requests that had the most rows returned from the database? So here, this request had 6,000 rows returned. You might look into your application and go, wow, I just didn't know we had requests that pulled back that many rows. Or you might say, well, okay, but they're all this add user. What other ones also bring back high amounts? So this highest DB row count on average will group it by URL. All right, and the biggest average one is this one at 2,000. The next one, this has 200 on average, and so on and so on. So really great stuff. And we've just touched the tip of the iceberg again. There's CPU-based stuff. There's most database queries. There's most data returned in bytes. So again, you might be concerned more about what data is being sent down to the browser. Again, these particular examples are not particularly interesting, but on your server, you might find something very interesting about what's being sent down to the browser. And on and on and on. And I could show lots more stuff, but in the interest of time, I just want to poke around a couple quick things. I talked about how IP addresses may be significant. What's been the most frequent hits by IP address? Now again, this is a synthetic load. Let me go to my own carehart.org server, and what are we looking at here in terms of time frame? November 18th, it's an hour, so I'm going to zoom out. And by the way, if anybody didn't notice, I clicked this little lock button, and that way, as I zoom out, things are automatically updated. So now we're looking at November 15th and November 22nd. So I don't know if I clicked it twice, but we're now looking at a week. Well, if I go to the deep server analysis and do request, I've only looked at requests so far. Again, they're just the tip of the iceberg. But most hits by IP address over that week what have been the biggest hitters of my server by IP address. I might want to investigate that. Maybe that's a source of trouble for me. And that's not in FusionReactor's interface, but the data's there. It's just that FusionReactor can't be made too much bigger because it's got to run inside the JVM. The whole point is FusionAnalytics runs on another server, and it's storing its stuff in a database, and it can do this kind of deep analysis that would be difficult for FusionReactor to do, and especially over time. So here we can see that whatever this guy is, he's doing the most most requests against my server. And by the way, a lot of these things in FusionAnalytics, if I right-click on them, I can see additional data. So in this particular one I couldn't, but sometimes you could right-click on something, like if I go to slowest requests during that week. Let's say on average. What have been my slowest requests on average during that week? Again, this is on my server, carehart.org. And those little simulated thing, that's been the slowest thing I've had. But other than that, these guys took 4 seconds on average. Yeah, I just happened to pick another one that doesn't let me right-click. But some of these things you can right-click and see other more interesting details. But let me collapse this. So that was request data. There's database-oriented stuff. There's memory-oriented stuff. There's CPU, thread activity, general. This starts to get into some interesting stuff. Server summary. So looking across all the domain names that have been requested on my server, and this is all, and I do have carehart.org and systemmanager.com, CF411.com. But you might sometimes find some interesting looking domain names. You go, I don't own those domain names. I've seen it happen on people's servers. So check that out. And then I mentioned that there's logs that are stored, so you can see the log file entries at a particular time. There's certain events that are watched for in FusionAnalytics, and I'll leave you to look into that more on your own. There's some hotspot analysis that it can look for what had been the highest use CPU times, memory times, request times, database times. There's something they call ColdFusion Monitor. Well, here's where I can see the sessions, for instance. So under General Statistics, in a moment when it populates, I can choose Sessions. And so now I'm watching sessions over that week. So there's my count of sessions over that week. And I could keep zooming out and see different stuff. So just all kinds of great stuff. If you use frameworks, there's a predisposed way to say, show me that stuff for my ColdBox apps, the request stuff, the database stuff. If I use Fusebox, Mach2, Model Glue, it's got predisposed ways of identifying the requests in those frameworks. So that's powerful. And then finally, if you want to break things out by application, by domain name, by URL, part of a URL, whatever you want, you can define an application, and then again, within that application, get your own metrics. All right? And then there's business metrics. There's reports that run every night in FusionAnalytics, and those reports can be configured to be emailed to somebody, and there's a status report, a TAP report, and an SLA report. Let me take a look at the status report, show you what that's about. Well, should have done the TAP report because that's a little higher level. Let me go back and pick the TAP report for yesterday. And it's already in the database, so it's just grabbing it and displaying it. And so it's giving my server a grade for yesterday, a score and a grade, 7 out of 10, and a grade of B. And it had been as high as 7.1, and it's gone down a little bit in the past 7 days. It was as high as 7.2 over the past 30 days and past year. And your server would probably look very different. My load is, relatively stable. But there's all kinds of stuff in here. Again, I'll leave you to look into this more on your own. But there's a lot of high-level information that could be helpful for a manager to understand. And then I had gone to the daily status report. This just breaks things down even further. And I'll leave you to look into that if you're interested. It's all in the docs. You can run the live demo yourself. But then it also breaks things down by application. So you can get a count by application of queries, query activity, database activity, request activity, execution time, bytes sent, by application. And then down here, what have been the slowest requests by application. So this is the kind of report you could give, bring to a developer meeting and give part of it to the developers of one app and give the other part to the developers of the other app. So again, this is FusionAnalytics, daily reports, the status report. And there's also a service level agreement report if that's interesting to you. And here's where you configure applications, where you configure the reports and who gets them, all that sort of stuff down here. Now finally I want to point out that there's clustering support. I don't have any clusters in my environment right now, so I can't demonstrate that, and I don't think the demo does either. But if you had clustered instances and you had them sending their data to FusionAnalytics, it could display things by cluster or across each individual server. This is against each server. There would be multiple servers here, and then you could see things across the cluster. So that's FusionAnalytics, really great stuff. Take a look at the website, take a look at the demo to understand more about it, and get information on downloading the trial. There's a trial on the pricing, all that stuff. I'll leave you to look into that. Any questions about FusionAnalytics? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I have to admit I haven't used it yet, so I don't know, but I think it's automatic. But here's the good news. Here's the good news. It's all documented. There's documentation, documents and sources, and we'll just get in there and type ColdBox and see what comes up. And I could have limited it to FusionAnalytics, but I don't think there'll be too many results. Yeah, so it's interesting. For some reason, the docs didn't get indexed for FusionAnalytics to even reference ColdBox, and that's too bad. It definitely is going to be in there in the docs. I don't know why the index didn't find it. But let me just say that if you try it and find that it doesn't work in a way that makes sense to you, and if you don't find the documentation, just email that support address. The same support address for FusionReactor will get to the right people. They'll get it to the FusionAnalytics engineers. And by the way, they're a great bunch of people. They're in a real office. It's a real staff of over a dozen people in an office in Germany. I've been there several times. They just moved into a bigger, really beautiful office. So it's a real going company. It's not a couple guys in a garage. And they spend a lot of time and effort and money and building and developing and evolving these tools. So again, I'm a big fan. They're wonderful support. They want to make you successful, not just when using the tool, but solving your problems for which you're using their tools. So again, I'm sorry, I don't know the particulars of that. I should have put together a little demo of it, but I'm sorry I forgot. So anyway, yep, thank you. Yeah, that's right. And even longer than that, that's right. They've been around, like I said, for about 8 years. Is when I started working with them about 7 years ago. It may have been a little bit longer. And by the way, they are ColdFusion users themselves. They created these tools, starting about 10 years ago for themselves. FusionReactor and FusionDebug, they developed them for themselves and used them in their environment and then realized, hey, we can make a business selling these tools. And I've been using it since about the second release, and it's just evolved tremendously. FusionReactor I'm talking about, and then FusionDebug from its very first release. So here we are at FusionDebug. So it's fusion-debug.com, and it's a interactive step debugging tool for ColdFusion and Railo. They should say that on this page because some of you may not use ColdFusion. You may use Railo. You can use FusionDebug with Railo. Now, here's Darren, who is the CTO of the company. If you haven't met him, you can watch this video and learn more about him. David Tattersall is what we would call the president CEO. They call the managing director over there. And if you watch this, you'll find out they're not German. They're British. But they are Brits who moved to Germany about 20 years ago. And again, about 10 years ago, started creating these tools. And then now it's grown into a company. And there are several Brits and several Germans and some folks from even other countries now. Anyway, good bunch of people. And so now let's move on to FusionDebug. So FusionDebug, again, is a debugger, step debugger tool. I wanted to demonstrate it, and I realized that I couldn't because I find that when I go to this download page, I wanted to get the latest version on the computer that I happen to be working on, And when I went to the download page, let me just show you, because you can try this yourself, and I'll talk in a minute about what a debugger is and why you'd want to use it. But I clicked on this download for Eclipse or download for CF Builder, and when I clicked on it, there was no download. So I've sent them an email telling them something's amiss. It looks like the site might have been updated recently. This should have been downloading. It's not downloading. Now in the case of FusionDebug for Eclipse, sorry, I just realized you don't need to download it. You use the Eclipse updating feature to get it. So let me just say this for those of you that use Eclipse. And in the interest of time, I'd be tempted to go ahead and download Eclipse and install it and show how quickly and easily you can run it. But let me just show you how easy it is, and you can try it yourself. So you just go get Eclipse. Now, let's talk about that for a second. The FusionDebug is a debugger that's built on Eclipse. CF Builder is also built on Eclipse. You can use FusionDebug either with Eclipse or with Flash Builder or with ColdFusion Builder, including with the CF Eclipse, if you know what that is. So just to back up, if you don't have any of them, unfortunately you cannot use FusionDebug with Dreamweaver. You can't use it with ColdFusion Studio. You can't use it with Sublime. You can only use it with Eclipse-based editors. That's just the way it is. Now, let's say you say, I don't use Eclipse. Well, you don't have to use it all the time. You could get it. It's free. Follow these steps. Install FusionDebug into it. See how to use it. Debug your code. And then go back to your other editor. So I know that may not make sense to some people, but some people it might, because the ability to debug your code, and I haven't even talked about that yet, what we're talking about is you can watch your code execute line by line, literally watch it running while it's running, and hit a button and say, go to the next line, go to the next line, go to the next line. And not only do you see it visually going to the next line, but you can display the values of variables as they're changing on the fly. Even cooler, you can set a breakpoint and say, well, just run until I hit that line of code. You don't have to go one line at a time. You can say, I'm going to put a breakpoint at line 758 and run the thing until it hits line 758. And then it stops and shows the debugger, says, okay, here we are. We're on 758. What do you want to do now? And as I said, you could display the variables that were in state at that time. You can even change the variables in the debugger. You can say, oh, well, there's our problem. That says value X and it's supposed to be value Y. Let me just change it to value Y and say continue running. And yeah, you can modify not the code, but the runtime state of the program on the fly. So that's the benefit of a debugger. I know a lot of CF folks never use debuggers because they never had one. And they've gotten used to using CF output and CF dump. But let me just talk about why might you need a debugger. Well, maybe your code that's failing is in a CFC, in a method which you can't output the results of because maybe it not only says output equals false on the component or the method, but maybe it's also something that's returning some data to a calling template, and it wouldn't make sense to do a dump at that point. You need to return just some data. You can't just dump stuff on the screen. There's an example where having a debugger can be valuable. You could literally stop in the middle of the CFC method and see the value of variables, make changes, step through, figure out what's going on. Here's another example. There are some things in ColdFusion code that you don't make happen. For instance, if you've used application CFC, you may know that there's an on-session start method. That's when the session starts. There's also an on-session end method. And that's when the session ends. That's not when you finish the request. It's when the session times out. So you might have a user who starts a session 20 minutes ago, doesn't touch anything, and then 20 minutes later, your on-session end code will run in your application CFC for that user session. Well, if you had FusionDebug watching that on-session end method, you would see the code pop up and say, okay, we're in the on-session end method. You couldn't have done anything to make that, knowing that was going to happen. Now, of course, again, you could do some dumping, but you couldn't do it to a dump to the screen because there is no screen associated with an on-session end, right? So maybe you could dump it to a file. Okay, I'll give you that. But the point is, that's another example where there are just certain things that it can be valuable to see while the request is running. So that's what a debugger is about. And again, I apologize that I don't have a live running demo. Back on that previous page, there was a discussion. There's also video tutorials, and you could watch videos and see it in use. So I want to make sure you know about that. Go ahead and watch these video tutorials to really appreciate what it's about. And these are very simple 6-minute demos that show you, getting started with it, using it. Then there's one on configuring it, and then doing with Flex applications, stepping through code, stepping through tags and CFCs, just all kinds of stuff, setting variables, all the things I've talked about. So definitely check it out. It can be a little tricky setting up sometimes, so all these videos will really help you. Let me say as well that if you go to my website, which is carehart.org, if you go to the presentations section, you'll find I've done hour-long presentations. If you just do a find on debug. Now here's using ColdFusion Builder's debugger, but beyond that, here's the CF8 debugger, and then beyond that, there's step debugging with either the CF debugger or FusionDebug. And then back longer ago, I talked about FusionReactor and FusionDebug, stepping through your code with FusionDebug, and I think that was it. So that was a few years ago. So anyway, I've got lots of presentations on it. I've got articles on it. If you go to the articles section, you can do the same thing. I've got blog entries on it. So I've been talking about FusionDebug and the CF debugger for a long time. I even did the chapters in the ColdFusion Web Application Construction Kit on using the debuggers, first in CF8 that was offered, and then the CF Builder debugger. So let me just say this about that before we go any further, because I'm sure somebody there is thinking, well, now why would we use FusionDebug if we've got the CF Builder debugger? So CF Builder, the editor from Adobe, if you get the paid version, it has a debugger in it as well. And it works very much like FusionDebug. They are very similar in functionality. They both leverage the Eclipse debugger. But let me say a couple things. First of all, you have to get the paid version of CF Builder. If you use the free version, it doesn't include the debugging capability. So you have to pay for it. And so you have to pay for FusionDebug. If you haven't paid for CF Builder, you can use FusionDebugger with CF Builder. Actually, whether you paid for it or not, you can use FusionDebug with it. And why would somebody do that? So you might say, well, I have the CF Builder debugger. Why would I ever want to use FusionDebug with that? Anybody know something that the CF Builder debugger requires that you might not choose to enable in your environment? And I'm not looking at the chat in case you wanted to throw a chat message in there. And he would be right. And that's the big deal. Yeah, ding, ding, ding. So you have to use the RDS feature of ColdFusion. Now, some of you don't know what that is, but others of you know it is what it is, and you know that it's also something to be very wary of. A lot of people will not enable RDS on their server. Now, you would typically be using this against a development server, so it shouldn't be that big a deal, but some people might choose not to enable it. Maybe you do a central development server, and your developers are all over the place. You don't want to open up RDS because it's something that's done over HTTP, and it can be tricky to secure it, and most people don't, and so it's a vulnerability. So many shops, during installation of ColdFusion, when they're asked, do you want to install RDS, they say no. Well, if you don't enable RDS, you can't use the CF Builder debugger. So those are a couple significant reasons, but beyond that, there's also functionality that the FusionDebug has that the CF Builder debugger doesn't have. Speed. The FusionDebug is really fast. I mean, I wish I could have shown a demo. I could just sit there holding the key that says, go to the next line, go to the next line, go to the next line, and you'd literally see it flying by the screen, just flying down the screen. It's not like a second and a second and a second. It's like milliseconds. Boom, 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 boom. I'm going through my code, which is tremendous to see. And then finally, a reason you use a debugger is maybe you need to understand how somebody's code works. And you've inherited it. And you need to know, well, how do they get from here to there? And you could maybe figure it out by studying the code, but you fire up a debugger and you just step through the code and you go, oh, it goes from there to there. And by the way, when you step into a line of code that's like a CF include, it opens the file and shows you the code inside the CF include. Now some of you go, yeah, but who uses CF includes? Come on, Charlie, we do CFCs. Oh, it works with CFCs too. If you're on a method call of a CFC and you say step into that method, it will open the CFC and say, here's your method, and here's the first line of executable code in that method. Thank you very much. Step through your code. Have a nice day. So it's definitely smart stuff. However smart you are, it'll work with you, and whatever your techniques are. And certainly those of you who use frameworks, you know you've had problems where you're trying to use code in a framework and it's like, how do we get from this view, this URL, request this page, how does it load that view and this controller, and what the heck, how's it getting from there to there? You can just turn on the debugger and follow it, go through the stuff, and you start to learn, oh, that's how that stuff works. So anyway, that's some of the benefits of a debugger. Really great stuff. And I think I've just said all the advantages. I saw somebody asking. And it's not expensive either. Let me go back to FusionDebug and pricing. That's only $199. $199. And again, it works with Railo. So if you use Railo and not ColdFusion, you can't use the CF Builder debugger. So I'll just say if you're using the CF Builder debugger and you can't get it working, maybe it's because of the RDS problem, maybe it's because of some other quirky things about the way they do things, you just might find FusionDebug's a lot easier. So come to the site, click the download page, follow the steps, install it, read the tutorials, send questions to the support address, again, support@fusionreactor.com. It'll get to the right people. There's a, I didn't say this earlier, there's a discussion list Google group, not only for FusionReactor, but also FusionAnalytics and FusionDebug. And there are people that share tips with each other on those. FusionReactor is the most active, and so you can learn a lot from those by checking them out. So I think that's it in terms of what I had planned to cover. So yeah, just, go ahead. I don't think so. No, that'd be 5 licenses across 5 different machines. Is that what you meant? So yeah, wherever you have your developers, it's just a volume discount. No, that is a purchase. That is a flat out purchase. Oh, actually, you know what? Sorry, that does say 1-year subscription. That's a good point. That must have changed. It used to be that it was perpetual, but you're right. I noticed that now that it's no longer. So, you can contact them to find out. Remember, at the top of the screen is the sales address and the phone number. So just reach out to them and ask them about that. I would suspect, since it's not listed there, it's not offered. And I don't know why. I've never really thought about that. I hadn't noticed it in a while. So good question. But yeah, check it out with them. Okay. So I was just going to wrap up with the last slides, just to say that FusionReactor is a great solution for monitoring your CF, Railo, any Java server engine. Can really help you be proactive and save you the pain of downtime. I tried to stress that up front. That's the beauty of it, is you can see what's going on while it's happening, before it happens, after it happens. You can understand it and solve those problems. So don't put up with things like that. FusionAnalytics, it's a great solution for analyzing your servers over time, spotting trends, those daily management reports, really great stuff. FusionDebug, great solution for step debugging through your code if you've never used it. Any kind of step debugging, it's amazing to see. Again, I apologize for not being able to show you an example, but again, just go to those videos and run them, and in a few minutes you'll see it working yourself. Don't forget, they've all got free trials. There's live demos of the server ones, and there's free installation support. So don't suffer with anything if you try using them. If you have any problem, reach out. The guys are great. They want to help. I might jump in. I help them a lot with stuff, so love helping solve problems. And again, that's what I do for a living, is helping people solve problems with ColdFusion. I do it over the web just like this. We get on and you remote into your server and I watch over your shoulders, so you don't give me access We just get in and solve your problem. So if I can ever help you solve a problem, let me know. That's what I do for a living. Sometimes within just an hour, I can make problems go away that have been bugging you for days or weeks. So don't put up with the stuff. That's what I'm trying to say with all this stuff. Don't put up with your troubles. Get these tools. If you can't use the tools, get help from somebody like me. If you have a problem trying to use the tool, contact them for support. Don't suffer any of this stuff. So there's probably a good tagline in there. Don't suffer. So I'll think about that. But anyway, any closing questions or comments? We're just before 9 o'clock hour. I see Jeff typing. Yep. And I had not been looking at that screen. By the way, I don't know if you're aware of this now, Daniel, but the when you're a presenter on Connect Now, the default when you run it is it minimizes this little tiny window, and you have to know to open it up to see the full chat pop. But even when I did, I was just so focused on the monitor that was sharing things, so I wasn't paying attention to the chat. Sorry about that. There you go. There you go. Yes, sir. Good for you. Thank you. Good deal. So was there anything that we missed earlier that is worth bringing up again, or? Cool. Okay. Yes. Excellent. Oh, do you? Good for you. Very good. And so that's great. I wish somehow you could put together something that would kind of show your perspective of why you guys have come to feel that. Because I say things, but people would love to hear it from somebody who really uses it every day. Yeah, it's crazy. Right. There you go. Exactly. And it's funny you say it's an afterthought in the community. I'd go even further. It's actually held in derision and disregard. It's like if you use it, disrepute. Like, oh, you use a debugger? Come on, be a man. Use CF board, CF dump. And it's like, well, wait a minute. There's a lot of reasons why that doesn't always work. And, it's got its hassles. Plus, you got to touch your code. With this, you're not touching your code. How many times have you seen people leave debug statements in their code and push it into production? That wouldn't happen with a debugger. But again, I realize that without being able to demo it, some people watching this won't yet have been sold on it. But again, please take the time, watch one of those videos, watch one of the presentations I've done where I walk through it. It's not hard. You guys are all using it, so you're a testament to the fact that there's value in doing it. It's not that difficult to get it done. It can work. I'll just say there's a lot of people that often try to get it working and have difficulty. So one of the presentations that I did that I pointed to on my website was all about overcoming challenges getting these debuggers working. Excuse me. And there's some challenges in the interface of CF Eclipse or Eclipse and CF Builder. There's challenges getting to the debug perspective sometimes. There's challenges opening the right windows. There's challenges setting up debug configurations. There's challenges getting the debugging setting in the the CF side working. There could be firewall challenges. So I've got presentations, like I said, where I go over all those sort of things. So don't suffer it. You're not alone. There's reasons why some things don't work. The guys at Integral offer lots of great resources, but if they don't help and if my resources don't help, just reach out and ask somebody. And gosh, it's great to hear of a group of folks like yourselves that use it all the time. It's almost like we should create a user group of debug users and meet to help each other out and show how to leverage it and help remind people of what the benefits are. And I try to think of a few scenarios just off the top of my head there but you guys might have even some other ones if you're going, I couldn't have done it without a debugger. In fact, let me just ask, we have a minute left. Is there anything where you guys would say, yeah, here's a great example where I couldn't have done that without an interactive step debugger? Yeah, cool. Sure, sure. And I would argue for most people, if they would just get into using the tool, then they would appreciate when and why they would use it. It's like an inertia thing. If they never used it, they hear people kind of poo-pooing it, or maybe they don't hear anybody talking about it, and they don't bother to try. But once you've been shown it and had it used working and can just open it up and fire it up, and you guys can attest to this, when you get it configured and working, you just open the template, point to a line of code, click a little, either a keyboard shortcut or you click on a little icon and say, I've set a breakpoint. Now go run the code. And you can run the code in your browser and it will be detected. You don't have to be in, it's not like debugging tools, and this is another thing. People think this can't work with ColdFusion because, hey, my code needs to run in a browser. I don't want to run inside the debugger. No, you're not running your page inside the debugger. You set the breakpoint in your editor, turn on the debugger, and then go run the page. And it doesn't have to be you. It could be another user. You could say, so-and-so tells me when they try to run it, it fails. Okay, well, you turn on the debugger and call so-and-so and say, go ahead and run it. And they run it from their browser against the server against which you're debugging. And you intercept their request and debug it while they're running it. So they just get a blank screen while you're debugging it. But eventually you say, okay, I got what I need. And you tell it to finish, and now they get the response. There's another great example of something which, could be difficult to do otherwise. So yeah, debuggers are great. Sure. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and run that by the guys. You might find out that they're working on it. These guys at Integral, they're smart, and they may have actually already started working on something like that. It's entirely possible. In fact, what you just said reminded me of one other thing we should say. You can also set the debuggers so that when an error happens, the debugger pops up. So you don't know where the error is, you just know there's an error that's happening. You turn on the debugger and say break on exception, and when an exception happens, up pops the debugger. And there again, you can look at all the variables that were in play. You don't have to think to have dumped them. They're right there. And that can be tremendously useful. So just so many features. I've actually got a list somewhere that I created of about 20 different reasons to use debuggers, and I couldn't find it before the presentation, but they're out there, and I'm glad to hear you guys attesting to it. So that's great. And it's been a good, right? There you go. There you go. Exactly. Right. Once you appreciate it, sure. And the event gateways, there's another example. If you use those event gateways, you know, there's no interface for them. So, yeah. Well, and let's just throw out that it is worth reminding people that if you really favor another editor, well, use that editor for your day-to-day stuff. And when you got a problem, fire up Eclipse or the CF Builder or CF Eclipse and run the debugger. Get your answer and then go back to your code. It's not optimal, but it could be done. The point is, I know people who won't use these because they are Eclipse based, and I say, well, don't worry, you don't have to spend your day in Eclipse. Just fire it up, do what it does. Think of it as a tool. You open up the tool, use it, do the job, close the tool, and then go back to using your editor. You know, doesn't have to be an all-day commitment. So, yeah, that's great. Well, it's really been fun talking to you guys who use it a lot. It's been fun talking to my peeps in Northern Virginia. I don't know if you guys know that I'm a native of the area, born and raised